Ladies and gentlemen, the session will now begin. Ladies and gentlemen, the session will now begin. Please take your seats.
Forced to migrate to avoid violence and persecution, refugees are legally protected by the 1951 United Nations Convention on Refugees and its 1967 protocol. Today, they are often denied their rights to safety, protection, and inclusion in the host societies. In December 2018, the United Nations General Assembly affirmed the Global Compact on Refugees after 2 years of extensive consultations. The main objectives of the compact are to ease pressures of host communities, expand access to third country solutions, and support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity. To what extent do refugees benefit from the existing legal frameworks on refugees' protection? What are concrete solutions to enhance the documentation of refugees and regularization of their administrative situation? How can we ensure sustainable socio-economic integration of refugees in the host communities, particularly in less developed areas?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our moderator for the Refugees, Protection and Integration session, editor at Africa TV and BBC, Vera Kwakofi.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for making time to join this conversation. It's my first Atlantic Dialogues, and I want to say thank you for the warm welcome. It's been fantastic. Thank you very much. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about a very emotive issue, and I know that talking about refugees elicits a lot of reactions. So I hope that you're going to help us have a fiery and educative and informative conversation this afternoon. So refugees, how do we protect them and how do we integrate them? I've got a very experienced and knowledgeable panel to help us have this conversation. So join me in welcoming Abdoullah Coulibaly, who is president of the Bamako Forum, Richard Danziger, who is the Regional Director for Western Central Africa for the International Organization for Migration, General Birame Diop, who is the Special Chief of Staff to the President of Senegal, Tesfahun Gobezay Kinfie, who is the State Minister, National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and last but not the least, Ambassador Losada, who is the EU Special Representative for the Sahel for the European Union. So, as you can see, we have a very capable panel. Please take a seat.
Thank you.
So let me start with a little fact for you. There are almost 4.5 million refugees in Africa. It's a huge number. But I've got a little test for you. What comes to mind when you think of refugees? So I'd like you to tell me. We're going to do a little exercise on your word cloud. What comes to mind when you think of refugees? So use your little pads, because I think it'll be quite interesting for what you think as experts in the room, people who work with refugees, people who encounter refugees. Some of you may have been refugees at one point in your lives. It's quite interesting. I'm quite interested to see what comes to mind. And you know, as a journalist, the issue of refugees is something that we've been covering quite recently. In the last week, We've been in Burkina Faso, where there is a refugee camp that's building just outside of Ouagadougou, to do some reporting from there. And that's something we never imagined that as an organization we'd have to a story that we'd have to tell. And so the issue of refugees is quite instructive. Wow. Is any of the words a surprise to anyone? I'm surprised by xenophobia as a cause for refugees. Interesting. Well, let me start actually by maybe giving us a way of looking at the state of refugees. Sorry, got lots of paper. State of refugees around the world today. Can you tell us, maybe I'll start with you, Richard, what is the status of refugees in Africa today?
Well, I would start by saying it's really not a good time to be a refugee. It never is, but perhaps worse now than it was 20 years ago for a number of reasons. But first of all, I would say with the collapse, or at least the weakening of the international order, the first people to suffer are going to be those on the move outside of their countries. So refugees and migrants, for example. I'm glad you said the situation of refugees in Africa, but we often think of refugees or refugees and migrants in terms of north-south, which of course is not the case. However, we often take our cue from the north when it comes to policy and treatment of refugees. And a very quick anecdote, when I first met a foreign minister of a country in West Africa, and at the time there was talk of refoulement of refugees from his country. We greeted each other, and before I sat down, this is in early 2016, he said, "Mr. Danziger, tell me what you think of this new agreement between Europe and Turkey on refugees." So he set the tone right away of, don't give me any lessons, not that I was going to anyway, when I see what's going on north of Africa. So in short, not a good time. Weakening of international human rights law and the refugee regime. Often also a vacuum or absence of the state in areas where there are a lot of people on the move. The numbers of people on the move mean it's increasingly difficult to identify who is a refugee and who is really in need of protection. And so we usually use the sort of minimum standard of protection rather than what I should think should be a much higher standard to grant people protection.
And from your perspective, Ambassador, where the EU, we know, is very involved in the management of refugees, what's your perspective on the situation? We know it's getting worse. How bad is it?
I mean, I think the situation is we are in a very bad situation nowadays, because I take on what Richard has just said. There is a concept which is very difficult to define. What's a refugee? There are three different concepts that I would like to highlight. A migrant, which is mainly for economic reasons. And actually, we have been talking yesterday about the problem of migration with populism, etc. I mean, there is a real problem there. But nevertheless, we mustn't forget, and I talk about the Sahel, which is the region I know the best, that in the Sahel and in Africa, 95% of the migration is internal. First point. And also that if we talk about migration, the history of mankind is a little bit like the history of migration. That's one thing. Then we have migration. We have, on the second part, we have what we call the IDPs, the international displaced persons. Why it is important to make this distinction? Because these people are suffering from a direct conflict. There are people who are affected by direct conflict, and inside of their own territory, they have to move around. That's the second thing. And the third are the proper refugees that are really fleeing to another country because of a real conflict. These three, actually, in the Sahel, one of the key reasons which started this whole mess, so to say, is the Libyan crisis, with no doubt. The Libyan crisis has a direct effect on that. There was a lot of migration were going to Libya usually. They can't stay there. They come down. I mean, they are in a terrible situation. And that's where we stand today. Then to try to have a proper reaction to what is happening in the region, first we have to know what we're talking about. If we're talking about migration pure economically, then Europe has set up an institution and many elements like La Valletta Conference and the Trust Fund with more than 200 million, more than 4 billion euros to fighting against the root causes of migration. If it's against IDPs, also there's special instruments that with IOM, with joint action, and we can talk about later, we've been working together also. If we talk purely about refugees, also we have on some other instruments that we are acting directly financially because the EU is really committed to that effect.
So 3 of my panelists have a direct relationship with managing refugees or having sort of seen what it's like to have refugees in your territory. Maybe I'll start with our representative from Ethiopia. You have refugees from multiple countries. Talk to me about your experience of dealing with and hosting refugees.
Okay, thank you. As you said, we have many refugees coming from many countries. The status says that around 1 million refugees are in Ethiopia. They come from 26 different countries, but mainly 98% of the refugees come from 4 of our neighboring countries, from Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, and Somalia. So what we are trying to do in managing the refugee crisis is we have established some 27 camps throughout the country, and a few fraction of these refugees live in the towns of Ethiopia. They have the right to move. They have the right to get services like any citizen of Ethiopians, and they get monthly stipends to compensate their living. And we are giving also access to education. Every refugee that's living in Ethiopia has the right to access to primary schools, and we have around 200,000 refugees that are learning in different careers of the education system. Especially, we have also established a new proclamation that is enacted in last year. It gives the right to refugees to move across the country, to have work permit, to get licenses and anything that a citizen can get. And to get these things, what a refugee has to do is to come legally to the country and to ask for a refugee status. When he requests or he or she requests to be recognized as a citizen, we have an agency called an Agency for Refugees and Returnees Affairs. It will issue an ID that designates the person as a refugee, and we will have any benefits that can be given to the refugees.
We'll talk a bit more about the kind of access refugees in your country have to the rest of the population. But one of the things to mention here is that it's a bilingual panel. So we're going to our French-speaking panelist, Mr. Coulibaly. You host refugees in Ethiopia. In your country, you found that in the last few years, you're creating refugees. Tell us a bit more about that.
Okay.
In Mali.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Well, in the case of my country, I would start off by saying that we all are potential refugees. So one has to be extremely careful when one addresses this phenomenon, because everyone may be struck. Some time ago, if I were told that I am talking about refugees in my country as I am doing now, I would not have believed you. So one of those days, there's actually this small school, a management institute, in which I provide grants for brilliant children who hail from poor families. So when you give such scholarships or grants, you have to conduct an investigation. And during the course of the investigation, we had a young Tuareg. Since we go and talk to the families, then we realized that this young Tuareg lived with her aunt. And she told us that her father was a refugee in Mauritania. This has led us actually to investigate further. So when we called her father in Mauritania, he spoke also of his neighbor who's also a refugee who hails from the center region. So the question was asked, how is it that all of this could happen? The first reason for the Tuareg, he actually explained that when we gained independence, we believed that we would be enjoying some special treatment conditions. And then we've realized that in spite of devolution policies and decentralization policies, we didn't have any water nor any power in those areas where we lived, and whereas we're saying that we all live in the same country, so we have started to complain, says he. So when we started to complain, the army was heavy-handed, and some of us have had to leave, including himself. So we wondered, why is it that all of this could have happened? And we were told, well, yes, you've created a decentralization process that was supposed to confer power or authority to the local population. It so happened that we've decentralized everything, save and except for the finance. So we put people in place who were supposed to be autonomous, but who had no resources to be so. What has happened? Those who were empowered without any resources were simply there, and they had to use local resources. They started expropriating people. For example, mayors, representatives of authority locally, they would go to people and expropriate. They would expropriate their real estate and resell it. So you had injustice, or the perception of injustice, that was such that people had started to complain. This has led to an overall crisis, and therefore, without any available resources, these mayors have started to target arable lands. As a consequence, there was very few lands left for men to farm and very few rangeland to feed cattle and livestock. Added to this, the rise of temperature and drought. Farmers have had problems, herders had problems, and herds started to die. You know that these herdsmen have only a single wealth. It's their herd. So they started taking their farms to pasture on farmlands. And you don't destroy the crop of a farmer. So this has given way to a conflict, and this conflict has grown so much in intensity that villages were targeted, lots of killings happened, and people were displaced within their own country, and some have had to leave abroad, and this is how some ended up as refugees in the case of the Sahel. And here I wish to talk about the issue of territorial governance, because very often in those countries, or in our countries, at the time of independence, we had countries that enjoyed tremendous diversity. But independence was assimilated to unicity, and we've choked out diversity. So this was such that this conflict has caused people to be displaced. This is the context in my country.
Political action, climate change, and corruption, and a few other things that have led people into leaving their homes to become refugees. They don't always stay at home. They head somewhere else. General Diop, Diop, yes. They head towards the border. They head towards you.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all thank our good friends of OCP for inviting me. I think I am one of the rare uniformed people to be invited to this event. And I'm very happy about that, because very often we are left aside. And I think we are part of the game, particularly when we are talking about refugees. As you know, Senegal has a quite strong experience in dealing with refugees. And the biggest community of refugees we have in Senegal is living in the northern part and coming from Mauritania. They have been settling there for about 30 years now. And we have learned a lot by doing. The first lesson we have learned is that to be successful in dealing with refugees, you need to listen to them. You need to give them the floor, because it's about them. You need to know what they're expecting, what are their vulnerabilities. They're traumatized people, confused people. Their basic needs are not fulfilled, so we need to listen to them and be patient with them. That's the number one lesson we have learned dealing for 30 years with the refugees in the northern part of Senegal. The second lesson we have learned is that you need an institution to give continuity to your actions. That is why in Senegal we have created what we call the National Committee in charge of refugees, returnees, and IDPs. And I am very honored to be the president of this committee, and that is why I am here. This committee is cross-cutting one. You have at least 17 ministries that are represented. So you have all the relevant stakeholders that can bring something to the refugees' protection and integration that are represented. And it gives a holistic approach to what we're doing. The second lesson we have learned is that you need a strategy. You need to formulate a strategy so that you can set up realistic objectives. So you can at least identify the capacities you need in order to reach your objectives. And the most important thing with the strategy is that you can sometimes pause and assess yourself and readapt or reorient what you're doing. That's very important. And the number three lesson we have also learned is that our approaches should be local populations based, because they are the host populations. If they do not welcome the refugees, if they are not aware of the challenges the refugees are facing, if they do not see an interest in interacting with the refugees, there is no way you can be successful in the way you're dealing with refugees. And the last lesson we have also learned is that you need to accompany refugees so that they feel they're protected, they feel that their basic human needs are fulfilled. We're talking about education, you're talking about also health access, you're talking about keeping hope, because without hope there is no life. And these people generally are hopeless. You need to protect their dreams, their aspirations, so that they can continue to believe in themselves. And there is also a need to make sure that trust is built between you, who are there to listen and to help, and the refugees. Those are the things I would like to highlight for my first intervention. And there are other things I can also share with you regarding the way we are empowering the local populations so that they can also, hand in hand, work with the refugees to protect them, to integrate them in a sustainable manner.
So there was a point you made which I wanted to put to Tesfahun. What motivates Ethiopia to keep hosting refugees, to keep welcoming refugees? Because you've got 1 million of them.
Okay. I think most of Africans are generous towards welcoming refugees, and it's a common practice throughout Africa. And to Ethiopia especially, it is well entrenched in our history, and throughout our history we are known as welcoming and hospitable to refugees. And secondly, when you really see it, the refugees that are coming to Ethiopia are not foreigners per se, because at the borders we share people. For example, if there is a problem in Somalia, those refugees are Somalis, and we have also Somalis in our territory. In Sudan, the Nuers and Anyuaks, they have brothers and sisters in Ethiopia. So it's all interconnected, and it's all about regional integration. So we are welcoming refugees not out of surplus or because we don't have problems, but we just want to work out with them, and we just want to succeed together.
Richard, does it make a difference, the affinity with the host community and the success in any refugee hosting community?
Absolutely makes a huge difference. And as the General said, it sometimes has to be fostered and encouraged by government. Now, I think fundamentally it's also true that in Africa people are welcoming. Where there's a problem, and this is also where xenophobia comes up, I think, in the word cloud, is it's very easy to whip up xenophobic sentiment. And I think if we look around at different refugee situations in Africa or elsewhere, you will find that somewhere there's a demagogue, there's some sort of political push or manipulation even to get people to cause problems or eventually push refugees out. I won't shy away from an example right now. We see it happening with Burundian refugees. And from a country that has since 1972 been extremely welcoming. In 1993 again. And now they're being pushed out. Yes, there is more there's less land available as the population grows. There's certainly a number of factors that make it more difficult for countries to welcome and integrate refugees. But it is, to me, it's very rarely a natural or organic phenomenon that a host community turns against people who they've been hosting for a number of years.
And Hel, what's the preference for the European Union in how refugees should be managed in country?
Well, the European Union, as I said, is really fully engaged with this problem. I would like to say that I've just made a tour with the United Nations because we need cooperation. One of the main things that I said, there are so many organizations, so many actors on the ground, that one of the main things that is coordination among ourselves so that we have no duplication, we all find the same goal. That's one of the main things. But coming back to what I said, I made a tour with the UN on the ground, and I realized, picking on what Richard and the General have said, I realized what happened to these refugee camps that we visited, because the situation in the Lake Chad Basin is dramatic today. It's really dramatic, and it will burst out even more, unfortunately, if we don't do anything immediately. Then we realized first that these refugee camps, sometimes the people there live better than the neighbors that they welcome them. This already creates a matter of friction. That's the first element. At the beginning, they're very welcome. And suddenly, little by little, they realize that, and it makes some friction. That's something we have really to develop the area also where these people are. But there is the big problem that was quoted in conflict, security. The security question, as I said at the beginning, after the Libyan crisis, is one of the elements which makes everything turn. Second element, or second point also, when we discuss with these refugees in this island in the middle of the Lake Chad, we were asking women, the women mainly, we have been raped and come back from Boko Haram. I mean, dramatic situation. We asked them, what do you want more? What are you trying to find? And they said something quite incredible. They said, first, we need education. Then that's why the EU is working also in that, to open the schools as many as possible, to try to open the school, but we need security for that. Why do they need education? Because it was because ignorance that they've been in the hands of these terrorist groups. That's the first thing they ask. And the second thing, we will never expect that they will ask that. They say, we want documents for our children. Because these people, when they travel, when they go away, if they have no documents, they are arrested and they are tortured or whatever. The situation is dramatic. Then that leads to the final point. We need the presence of the state. Then the vacuum of the state, I always say this sentence, is the oxygen of the terrorism. If there is no state, these people are in disarray. And we have to work very much for that purpose. And the EU is committing a lot of its efforts for this region. And finally, and I finish that, and sorry if I'm too long, for those other refugees that have been up to Libya and have been found in a almost slavery situation, have been taken as hostage, more or less, of these groups, of these criminal groups. Together with the IOM, we made a joint initiative to bring them back. We found 23,000 in the desert that we brought back. 68,000 came back to the point of origin, either in the Horn of Africa or in the Sahel. And 70,000, we give them help at home, because when they come back, they need also a support. Then again, the nexus, security, development are the basis of everything, and humanitarian aid. But humanitarian aid is only a first step, is only the immediate step. You need the development, and development is now what we are trying to enforce as much as possible.
Tesfahun, I saw you nodding when Angel was talking about tensions in communities. Is that something that you've experienced in Ethiopia, and what's been behind that?
Yeah, I think he has raised very important points. One of the things that brings change of attitude towards refugees is, as he mentioned, national security. And the other thing that we find in experience is that refugees, when they come in mass, there would be deterioration of resources, because their camps would be built upon some lands, fertile farms, or on a forest. And the cooking and other activities of the refugees would further deteriorate the resources of the area. So it creates a tension towards hating or unwelcoming refugees. Of course, we have a good experience, and as I said earlier, there was no major national security incident that occurred to us, because we are having a lot of works with the refugees. For example, we are creating organizational structure within the refugee campus. We will group some refugees to watch out if there are any incidents or any abnormalities in the region, and they would report to the police or the National Intelligence Service, so that corrective measures would be taken immediately. In this sense, we haven't encountered any national security challenges, but the resource deterioration. And the third point I would like to add is it creates a burden, and it needs a lot of resources to carry out. For example, we have planned to establish some industrial parks in which 70% of the host and 30% of the refugees would have a work opportunity, a job opportunity. And we are trying to build some industrial parks, but we are not able to have the necessary resources. And the international community, I think, should plan on helping the development and other initiatives that would change the refugee status dramatically.
But aren't you setting yourself up for even more tension in your communities when you're setting up an industrial park for refugees in a community that didn't have one before they came along? You're giving them papers, you're giving them access to communities. Aren't you building up to even more trouble in the future? Why is it important for you to offer those resources, especially when you don't have the money to do them yourselves?
Okay. So you raised a very nice question, and I think it would make my point if I tell a story of our country. There is a certain place called Melkadida in the Somali region of Ethiopia. There was no infrastructure, and we tried to get international fund for irrigation project, which we luckily found, and we used that fund to construct irrigation in that area, and we gave 1,000 hectares of land for 270 households of refugees and 270 households of host countries, the host citizens. And we developed the irrigation system. Then they are using it properly, and they are sharing it commonly. And it is it's perceived as something that came due to the refugees. So we are trying to make this sentiment in other areas, but it needs a huge investment, and it needs a huge money. We have a 10 years strategic plan that's developed, and the 4 thematic areas that are incorporated in the strategic plan are jobs and creation, education, environmental protection, and capacity building for the refugees and for the host. So what we are planning to do is to incorporate the refugees and the hosts, and to shift their focus to further development of the area, so that they would benefit from the efforts.
You wanted to intervene.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that in the different testimonies,
to say that with regard to the testimonials of some of those refugees, particularly those who lived in decent conditions who end up in camps, they are facing the real prejudice of the absence of healthcare services. This is a real concern they have in living in such camps. And they've also focused on drug abuse, substance abuse, and also the cooperation that is extended by some to those jihadis, because they were also infiltrated, and the danger therein is stigmatization, because on both sides of the border they have started to not be trusted so much as they were in the past. So this further exacerbates the security situation. So therefore, the young girl who was at my school was telling me that her father has had the dream to simply come back, and some have started to come back to the country. And when they come back to the country, and when those community strife restarts, they end up as a yo-yo. They go back and forth, and therefore their life is paced by peace and security, peace and security.
Talk about the security angle of hosting refugees. I know that one of the Westgate attackers who attacked Westgate Mall in Kenya trained at the Kakuma refugee camp. And whether it's true or not, there is a lot of concern among coast communities that refugee camps are fertile ground for breeding insecurity. Is that something that is borne out by your evidence? How do you deal with that kind of feeling amongst those communities about their safety?
Yes, that's a very important question. Particularly now that we have violent extremism all over our boundaries. So our topic is about refugees at the borders. Refugees by nature are very vulnerable people because of the fact that they're not only traumatized, they lack of almost all basic things. They generally do not have hopes. And on top of that, given the fact that they are at the borders that are known as being gray areas, where the states very often are absent, where the administration is not present, so the vulnerability increases. And the bad guys are very well aware of that. So generally, they try to go and intervene to win the battle of the hearts and the minds before the state comes to these people. And so more and more now, the refugees constitute a community that could be a reservoir for the recruitment of the bad guys. This is something that is very serious. That's why, in my opinion, we need to make sure that our states take the refugees crisis as a very important threat to their national security, without making the mistake to hold the refugees as responsible of the situation. There is a balance to make. But in the meantime, beyond the role of the state, we need to come back to the host populations. Those are the ones living 24/7 with the refugees, so they need to be given the primary role in protecting the refugees and also in integrating them. That is why in Senegal, we have conceptualized what we call the cultural huts. Cultural huts because we think that refugees at the borders and the local population, generally they come from the same community. They share the same culture. And culture, happily, is one of the rare factors that have survived the drawing of our boundaries. So building up on culture makes sense when you want to have refugees interact with local population. So in these spaces, on a regular basis, the populations get together with the refugees and they try in a very participatory manner and inclusive manner to assess all the challenges they are facing as a community. And together, without the support of the state, they try also to put in place solutions to their challenges. It's a very successful story, in my opinion, that could be duplicated and contextualized in many places where you have big communities of refugees.
Richard?
Yes, I mean, I always get very worried when we start talking about refugees or migrants and potential terrorists or being radicalized and so forth. So yes, they might be people vulnerable to radicalization, but no more than the general population and possibly less. We even had that problem, Ambassador Losada mentioned 60,000 we brought back from Libya, or even those stranded in the desert. There's always great concern when they go home. Often security agencies want to interview them, which is fine. There are, of course, important security concerns in the region. But it becomes too easy to stigmatize refugees and migrants. You know, if we look at the profile of many of these people, they're going to be actually the last to be radicalized for a number of different reasons. And I think also we have to remember that these are not people with no agency. They can make decisions for themselves in what direction they want to go through. I think one thing that is enormously important, and it doesn't surprise me, when you said that in the middle of Lake Chad, these women were saying, Ambassador, that they wanted documentation. Documentation is incredible. We don't realize how important it is, or maybe we do if somebody picks our pocket, but how important documentation is. And one of the weaknesses in West Africa and the continent is the whole civil registry system. So people grow up without ever having had any formal identity. Now, this is a problem for accessing social services. It's a problem when it comes to security issues. And again, in 2019, we have to take that into account, that it's good to know that the person in front of you is the person that they say they are. But it's also important if they have to flee across the border to be able to show on the other side of the border where they're from. And finally, it would start beginning to address the issue of statelessness, because this is another group that we haven't talked about. We've mentioned IDPs, migrants and refugees, but we have stateless people who may be stateless in a traditional sense, or people having fled a country no longer have that nationality, but are not given the one of their country where they fled to.
There are a lot of examples in Kenya.
Okay, but there's also people who might be third, fourth generation, or maybe even countless generations, who don't have an identity card and can easily be described as foreigners. And it's interesting that this issue often comes up during election periods. So I think the issue of civil registry, and it's something that in IOM repeat all the time, and we do a lot of work with ECOWAS on trying to assist them and countries in the region with putting together biometric identity cards, because this, I think, will be of just huge benefit to people whether they stay at home, whether they go on the move, and to states themselves.
So it's not as if some of the interventions that could help one, confirm to host communities that hosting refugees can have advantage, especially if you're a deprived community. There's no shortage of interventions that says that the state needs to be present. So why are these things not happening? Why is this still an issue that keeps coming back over and over again? Do you want to take that, Angel?
Yes, I can take it, because we are, one of the main problem of everything, as I said at the beginning, is the insecurity itself and the situation of conflict today in the area. This insecurity creates all these problems, and it's very difficult for the NGOs, for instance, to work when there is this insecurity.
Is that the problem, that when it comes to managing refugees, hosting refugees, it's been left to NGOs who have their own agenda, who have their own fundraising challenges, to manage the first response rather than the state being the one to ensure that it's happening?
Well, we come to the first problem then. Of course, the state should take care of that, but we are talking about, in the Sahel at least, of weak states with little capacity, and for them it's an incredible burden to receive all these refugees. They have problem with their own population. I said before, one of the things which struck me when I was there, that we went to the village next to this place and the people were living in worse condition than in the refugee camp. This, of course, creates a conflict sooner or later. Then what we try to do is to develop this area in order that the people there also take benefits from that. At the beginning, they are received with open hands. Yes, they are here. But then little by little, the conflict starts. You're right. The first task is of the state itself will receive them, but the international community has also, and the EU particularly with other organizations, has also a role to play, and we try to play it as strong as possible. But security today, at least in the Sahel, linked to development, because the nexus is fundamental. If you don't have the both together, no security without development, no development without security. We don't bring them together in this sort of integrated approach that we try to have. We won't go anywhere. We are conscious of that. We work on that basis, and on that basis we work in coordination as much as possible, with the difficulty I said before, because there are many actors also on the ground, many NGOs, many actors. We have to try to find a proper coordination among ourselves so that we can really be effective, and to try to give a solution, immediate solution to these people, and at long term, because refugee is something which shouldn't last too long in principle. If it lasts, then we have a real problem. It should be the first step. They have to be reintegrated, as the topic said today. They have to be reintegrated. We have to help them where they're going to be reintegrated, and we have to develop the area where they were. That's a little bit the scheme that we try to find. We put a lot of financial effort into that, but still, as you said, because of insecurity, because the Sahel, if we take the figures of Burkina Faso, they're amazing. Since January this year to today, we jumped from 50,000 IDPs, refugees, whatever, going one side of the border, to 300,000 in only 11 months. I mean, something quite dangerous. I mean, and it's going worse and worse. Burkina Faso is another area, by the way, that we have to look at it, because in the border with Mali, today the insecurity there is growing at a very, very fast step. And that is one of the main things. We have to fight security. We have organizations for that, like the G5, from the security point of view. There are a lot of initiatives, Franco-German, European Union, proper initiative from ECOWAS in the security sector that we support financially and on training, and that's one of the main aspects that we're trying to solve.
So we've got about 20 minutes left in this conversation, and I'd love to invite some questions from the room. But I have a little vote thing for you to do. So the question for you to vote on, because of your intervention, brings us perfectly towards that. Do you think refugees should have the right to permanently live in their host country? Yes or no?
It's a poor thing. Poor thing. Really poor.
So we'll do a countdown to the vote. Should refugees permanently live in their host communities? Permanently. Voting. So that counters the point you've just made, Angel, that refugee status should be a temporary thing.
I mean, I said that because seeing the camp that I've seen, most of the people wanted to go back to the village.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I've seen. That's what I've seen on the ground. Of course, IOM works always on a voluntary basis. We work on that basis also. We cannot force anybody either to go or to stay. But when you talk to them, really they want to go back to the village, but they can't because of the security situation. I come back to the first problem that I mentioned. And the situation of refugee mustn't be a situation for all your life. You're not going to be all your life. I mean, you need some other expectation. You need your children to be educated. You need your children to go away, to have the proper life. You cannot be a refugee all your life. Something different is if they can stay in the country where they are, that depends also on the circumstances. But
who voted yes?
What I've seen on the ground is that they all wanted to come back to their villages.
Do you want to tell me a bit more about why you voted yes and what that means? Sorry. Okay.
Very often, refugees need to integrate into their own communities because they do stay for generations and generations. And we know that the research shows us that when people stay for generations and they are not allowed to be part and integrate within their communities, it leads to a sense of not knowing who you are. It's very, very detrimental to personal and to collective development of both the host population and the refugee population. Yeah. Can I take advantage to ask my question?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Harmony Toros from the University of Kent, and I share very much Richard's concern of this mixing of security and refugees and showing them as a security threat. And I was wondering if the panel could say something about the fact that there is a movement towards counter-migration policies, particularly from the global north, of bringing in money and development funds, as in to say, we will give you this money to stop people from coming. Right? And my concern with this is, well, aside from the ethics of it, which I think is rather questionable, but on top of it, the concern is that a lot of this money, for me, reflects some of the money that came in with counterterrorism. And this money tends to be used in the worst possible ways. It tends to be used not in defense of democracy and not in defense of the building up of good, healthy societies, but rather just to prevent things from happening and reaching the global north.
Okay.
I was wondering what you think about that.
One question from here as well.
So, my name is Glenn Murray. I was a cabinet minister in the Ontario government and mayor of a major Canadian city. So I view it as a different perspective. I think people coming to Canada have a right to live there. I see a crisis coming of unprecedented proportions with climate change. We have a lot of Canadians from the Punjab region. They're reporting extended periods of time of temperatures at 55 degrees Celsius and greater. Large parts of the planet are going to become uninhabitable. Syria was a 1 in 900 year drought between 2006 and 2011 and created a domestic and the cascading xenophobia that happened in some European countries. So as a Canadian, I expect part of our climate change settlement is going to be the acceptance of mass numbers of folks from many parts of the world, probably on a somewhat permanent basis. I think one of the early problems is Central America, because imagine the probability, I would think, of Mexico experiencing a Syrian-style drought. Let's say there's 10 million Mexicans refugees. The Trump administration is weaponizing the border. Canada, I would hope, would send refugee and immigration officers and have a humanitarian response if Mexico loses its water. They are now projecting significant loss of operational farms in the last year, water shortages. We have to have a global settlement strategy. We better do it while we're doing it for positive economic global humanitarian partnerships than waiting for the nativist, populist, quasi-fascist kinds of governments to take over in potentially host countries. So
but how long do you think that honeymoon will last? Well, when the pressure is building, and the U.S. is sending all its refugees
downtown Toronto, and my
Canada.
Last 12,500 constituents were Syrian farmers. It would be nice, since we have some farming issues, to be able to settle them in farming communities. When I was mayor of Winnipeg, we had a depopulating city with an excess number of communities. 10% of the city is Punjabi, 10% is Filipino. We're building mosques and Muslim schools when I was mayor to accommodate a growing Muslim community, settling that in with the Jewish community taking a major role. We need, as leaders, to create, as the Aga Khan said, civilization is a march from tribalism to pluralism. And in too much of the world right now, we're marching from pluralism to tribalism. And I think we have to have a larger cultural discussion between leaders. And I'm here because I want to meet people from other parts of the world who see the time-limited opportunities to do this properly and to build those dialogues.
Thank you very much. Let me hold up for you.
My name is Vitor Borges, and from Cabo Verde. I didn't vote. I didn't vote because I think it's a trap question. We cannot go on simplifying complex issues with a yes or no answer. I believe that the answer will depend on the countries of destination, with the situation, with the political situation. So, and I see a lot of this tendency to try to come out with easy questions from complex situations.
But you have to admit that for local communities, it's often black and white.
No,
yes?
No, it depends on the way we manage the situation. It cannot be yes or no. It can be yes in Canada, perhaps it cannot be yes in a poor country. So we need to come out with a solution that fits the reality on the ground. Next point. It's good to take care of refugees. But my question to the panel is the following one. Protection should begin with prevention. Now, with this experience of refugees, what did we learn from the causes of these waves of refugees? What is being done, or what can be done to prevent the history repeating itself again and again?
Okay, thank you very much. I've got two hands up. I'll hold it for you, don't worry. Don't worry, I'll hold it.
Merci.
Thank you. My name is Hassan Saoudi from the Royal Institute of Strategic Studies. I believe that, just like Mr. Ambassador said, those that have visited the refugee camps would not have answered in such a way. The only request of refugees is to be able to return home. And that's very clear, and obviously the demands in terms of healthcare or education, but of this uprooting is a very important factor for these refugees, in addition to all of the psychological repercussions. But obviously what's requested is the return conditions. So the gray zones have already been addressed, but there's also the internal conflicts. And these internal conflicts need what we call the national reconciliation, whether it's with regards to faith or whatnot. And this is a duty that the states need to uphold. And this, unfortunately, what we've not addressed is the continental organization. The African Union has a role to play in this reconciliation, the Council of Wise Men, the warning systems, and unfortunately these are mechanisms that are honestly failing. And we need to be honest here, and we were lucky to be able to see these issues firsthand and witness these issues firsthand, but we need to know that a refugee the refugee status is meant to be temporary and which is not meant to last. And the ball is in the camp of the public authorities, but also of our continental organization, which unfortunately in this field has not really made enough effort. So
responsibility in protecting the citizens of the continent of Africa.
Madam, I am not able to answer this question.
Has it provided any leadership?
Given the fact that I'm still an active duty officer, and
but
I cannot engage.
Has it failed to provide leadership?
It's a very tricky and delicate question. I will just remain in the technical and professional part of my job. So I will be only answering technical problems, not political questions.
Okay.
Now, coming back, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I totally concur with my good friend from Cabo Verde, Minister Borges. It cannot be a yes or no question. Because depending on the time you're asking the question to the refugees, you have very different answers. Right in the beginning, it is understandable that the majority of refugees, they want to go back home. Because they are connected to their families for decades, and they want to go back home. And the statistics have shown that most of the refugees are refugees because they are trying to run violence, because of insecurity. And so the refugees are refugees because they don't have another choice. If they're given the possibility to return, they will return quickly. But the refugees are very realistic. If they spend too much time on the country of settlement, in general, they change their mind and accept the fact that they cannot return, and they try to settle permanently. That's what I wanted to answer to the question of my brother Borges.
I haven't forgotten your question, but what's yours?
Yeah, my name is Alan Kasuja. I'm a former refugee. We ran away from Uganda during Idi Amin's time, and we went back to Uganda when Yoweri Museveni took over. So this is a conversation that's very important to me. First of all, part of the problem, I think the West doesn't really understand this issue. They don't because they've never been refugees. How do you make it important in Brussels and Washington, D.C. when they don't appreciate what it means like to run away from safety? So it's not a problem that they'll understand, if I'm to be frank with you. For Africans, and I'm really proud of the leadership that Uganda has shown on how to integrate refugees into host countries and make them part of the country that they come from. And part of the reason is because Museveni had to run away. He and his family got the benefit of running to refuge. Kagame had to run away, grew up in Uganda, and we know the rest of the story. And I think also just the idea of calling these people refugees is frustratingly dehumanizing them. I hate that word. I wish they didn't have to be labeled refugees.
What word would you use?
I think they're just human beings who need a safe place. We need to find a word that sort of takes away the stereotypes that comes with calling someone or branding them a refugee. Because it's been misunderstood, it's been bastardized, and as a result, they're being looked at as a problem. It's just someone trying to find a safe place for them and their children. Women, mothers, pregnant, children, babies like Alan Kurdi, who was thrown into the sea because, how many stories? As a journalist at the BBC, I have covered this refugee story for a very long time. I spent 5 days in Byumba refugee camp in northern Rwanda, and then followed a refugee family to the United States in Seattle to understand the resettlement process. I've also seen Alan Kurdi floating onto the shores, this Syrian child who just needed a place to be safe. So anyway, long story short, for the African country, it's a logistical problem. Let's just work on the logistics and refugees will be fine. Sudanese can go to Uganda, Congolese can go to Uganda, just build the capacity for Uganda to absorb them.
Is there enough land? Is there enough food? Is there enough water for everybody? Yes. You've got your mic on.
Ouais.
Yeah.
Moi, je voudrais juste dire...
So I simply would like to react to the question of our friend Victor, what to do to ensure that history will keep repeating itself. One of the answers is to address the causes of why people leave. And obviously no one wants to leave except when we leave to return. So the causes for the departure from our countries in general are, first of all, governance-related issues. When people don't feel, because they feel that they're victims of injustice, because they feel that there is too much corruption, or if they have the impression, because when you are right and you go to the courts and you lose the court system and then end up being jailed, well, these are all reasons for revolt. And so when this is what causes people to leave. So it's important to ensure that the good governance is in place to avoid for people to leave. Now, for countries the Sahel region, or such as my country, with a large, wide land surface, where the territorial management is challenging, and the state alone cannot handle the security of the entire territory. This is why there is this notion of holding the local populations accountable, and also to respect diversity, because this is also a very important notion. We cannot put down this diversity. This diversity is also a source of wealth. Another important element is that these conflicts arrive because some people are saying that they left and they need to come back. It all depends of how long they left, because if you stay for a very long time, well, some people end up settling in your place. And so when you return, and this is something that we can see in certain countries, there are people that have settled. And so we create a new source of conflict that can create a new reason for departure. So this duration is also important. This is why the refugee status should be limited in time. The other factor that I would like to insist on is that there are conflicts because people don't lack perspective. And what is this perspective? This perspective is work. It's important to give. There's no outlook. People need jobs. People need employment. And Africa this brings us back to the issue of governance, because when we have resources and when we try to sell these resources to others, we have enough water, we have a workforce. So why shouldn't we have a good strategy to transform these processes and create jobs? And I will end my answer then. Thank you, Mr. Coulibaly. So
your question, I'll hold the mic for you. Don't worry, I'll hold the mic.
Okay, I was going to make a comment.
Yes.
Yeah. With the Douche Policy Center for the New South, I just wanted to add to what the gentleman before just said, that there's a lot of theoretical discussion about refugees. As a former refugee myself, I can tell you that there are circumstances, certainly the ones we lived through, where the last thing you want is to go back where you came from because of fear of your life. So, do the refugees have a right? Why did I say yes? Why did I vote yes? Well, first of all, of course, there is a legal obligation, once you are declared a refugee, to give a vote to the refugee, but that's not the main point. The main point is that when you're in that situation that you cannot go back, what is the alternative? You have no papers, you're not able to work, you're not able to travel because you have no papers. So it is an obligation, a humanitarian obligation, as well as a legal obligation to provide the refugee with a boat on a lasting basis so that they can build a new life.
Thank you very much. So from the interventions, I think my sense is that We have a huge crisis on our hands. It's not getting any better. The solutions are very complicated. What you don't want is to create a long-term problem through your solution. But if you were a refugee in Africa or anywhere else in the world today, what should you fear the most? Should you fear about your future? I'll start with you. You were nodding, so I'll start with you.
Yes, I mean, I think if you're a refugee right now, you want to fear for your future. There's also a lot of people still living within their own countries where the refugees came from who also fear for their future. And I think perhaps the question could have been posed a little bit differently, which is, should somebody permanently remain a refugee? And that, the answer, of course, is no. And yes, a lot of people want to return home, but then if they're still in that country when their children are born, they begin to have a different home. Look at Afghans, for example, who've been refugees for 40 years now. The new generation, they don't even know their own country. But I think the most important comment came from the gentleman from Canada. We better figure out very quickly how to deal with the issues of refugees and migrants, because it's true, with climate change, there are going to be a lot more people on the move. And whether it's Africans within Africa, whether it's Africans going to other countries, or in any case, people from any continent in the world, if we don't start looking at developing policies for welcoming and resettling people and finding ways to give them livelihoods, if we can't do it for the relatively small number of people who are displaced now, and I say relatively small because obviously it's already, I think, 40 million around the world, we're going to be in big trouble down the line when we have many more people coming from island states, coming from areas that are gradually becoming desertified.
So we've got barely a minute to wrap up. So final word from you, General Diop.
I would like to emphasize the fact that the data is showing that most of refugees are refugees because of insecurity. Yes. So conflict prevention is also part of the long-term solution. If we want to lessen the number of refugees throughout the world, we should be working very hard on conflict prevention. This is really my takeaway. Thank you.
Tesfahun?
Yeah, one of the major reasons for refugees is, as my friend General Diop said, is conflict, and the conflicts that are the causes for mass displacement of people are taking long to be solved. So that is why refugees are remaining for long as refugees. There are three solutions for sustainable
we have time for one, I'm sorry. We have time for one solution.
Okay, we have time. So the one solution, I think it was raised by the question from here, is the European and other Western countries are trying to push the pressure to other African countries to manage the refugee crisis in themselves. So that's creating a problem because, for example, if we take every African country, there is a problem in themselves. We have unemployment problem, we have lack of financial capacity. So when refugees are added to this, it would create a national burden and it would fester other negative thoughts towards refugees. So that's why it's needed to get the international support that's needed to change this problem.
Angel, does the European Union have a key solution, a key strategy that it wants to deliver in managing refugees in Africa?
I mean, our key strategy it's very difficult to find a key strategy to such a complex situation. But yes, I fully agree with what the General has said and what has been said before. And I said that at the beginning. I mean, the problem is first the security. Then, yes, the EU has its own strategy, which links against security and development, this nexus. And that's what has to work on the ground. And for
Do you think your partners in Africa are doing their part?
We are working with them together. At least that's what I'm saying. But I will open the debate at the end with another question, which from the gentleman from Canada, which we was talking about the climatic change. Yes, that's a real problem for the future, which is even multiplied by another element that we haven't talked about, is the demographic explosion in the area. Demographic explosion plus climatic change plus insecurity makes a very difficult situation to face today. And for that, the only way is prevention, working together, coordinate together, and real cooperation among all ourselves.
I'd like, if we have another session next year, to bring back this conversation, because I think there's lots for us to talk about. Thank you very much. You've been a fantastic audience. Thank you to my guests.
Thank you.
Abdoullah, Coulibaly, Richard Danziger, Birame, Diop, Tesfahun, Kinfie, and Angel Losada. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for an engaging afternoon. Starting 7:30, we invite you to join the Moroccan dinner at the Moroccan restaurant of the Mamounia. Please follow the signs and staff directions and enjoy your meal.